Good afternoon. Welcome to my presentation. Today I'm examining German American ethnic and racial identity through a critical lens. You see on this first slide, all the pictures actually are pictures that I have taken myself. You can see on the first slide here, I have a family picture, a majority of them women. My family was filled with very strong women. You have my great-grandmother on the far left, one of her nieces above her, my great-great-grandmother in the black dress in the middle, another distant relative on the side. In the very front, you have my grandmother, whose eye seems to be blacked out. But this was taken, I think, around 1949, 1950, so it was after the war and before my family moved to Germany. Here you have my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather sometime around 1930, 1931 in Prussia before they moved to Nuremberg. Conceptual foundations of race and ethnicity among German Americans. From the first days of German emigration to America, German Americans held their identities as Germans in higher regard than they did other white Americans, a cultural superiority, as Carlson points out, that had as its primary goal the aspirations of acculturating an ignorant American populace. Basically, the Germans felt that they were better than everybody else because they came from a nation that had culture, that had opera, that had science. While viewed by many Americans, as white, Germans saw themselves as distinct and even superior to American whites. But by the time of the First World War, there was an increasing commitment to their newfound home in America, and a fear of being sanctioned by the U.S. Led to increasing alliance with white Americans. And then in the between years, between World War I and II, German ethnic identity rebounded, but there remained a firm commitment to American whiteness, especially when the formerly German strongholds in cities like Philadelphia saw an influx of black people escaping Jim Crow and moving into the Northeast. Eugenics, as we've all studied, a uniquely German American invention, emerged from German halls of education and was adopted by American scientists and politicians to promote ideologies of white supremacy, manifest destiny, and ethnic genocide here, whilst reinforcing white supremacy and eventual anti-Semitic genocide back in Germany via the establishment of the Nuremberg Laws. Eugenics gained traction in the States as a way to promote biological bases for segregation and oppression of black people, thereby closely linking German Nazi policies with American race policies. Here's some more images of my family. At the top is a school picture from the carnival period. My grandmother is squeezed right in there. You can see the sort of two cowboy-looking guys in the front. Well, if you go up one level and over to the right, you can see my grandmother looking off in the distance wearing a white dress. Her sister is on the other side of the tall guy that stands between them. They were standing in front of a bombed-out building that was next to their home in Germany. And then at the bottom is my grandmother holding my Uncle Tom. He was born in Switzerland. They had moved to Switzerland at the beginning of the 60s, sitting with my mom. That showcases that my family was able to make it out of some challenges. They made it out of World War II and were able to move to Switzerland and eventually the States. But German Americans excelled in what Carlson liked to call cultural pluralism, as a process by which Germans, they held on to many cultural markers such as music, food, religion, as well as a traditional nuclear family structure, while also assimilating easily into the greater white American society. German ideologies generally aligned with American, but during the two world wars, obviously, German American allegiance was called into question. Many Germans subdued their own heritage, changed their names, for instance, from Schmidt to Smith, and otherwise assimilated or adapted into American culture. They even began to form sort of their own mythologies around American founders, adopting ideologies of Washington and Lincoln. There was even a story, and you can look on the internet for this. There was a massive Nazi rally, held in Madison Square Garden in the 30s, uh, that invoked the names of Washington as somebody who was a great settler of lands, a manifest destiny of clearing out unwanted populations. Between and after the wars, German Americans revived a love for Heimat. Heimat is what we call home. It means a little bit more than home. Heimat is both a home as well as a feeling that you get when you're at home, the community you get at home. But this German nostalgia was also aligned with some American ideals of white supremacy and anti-black racism, and that was spurred even more on by the eugenics movement. Um, these ideals like religiosity, hard work, maternalism. Maternalism is the belief, right, that a woman's place is in the home, raising children. It helped to support German Americans' ability to assimilate, right, and at times even influence the establishment of such things that we've heard about, such as the widows' pensions and settlement houses. Congressionally chartered German American alliances that had supported the Germanic cause pre World War One. Theodore Roosevelt even praised Kaiser Wilhelm for his traditional German values. Those alliances reemerged in small ways between and after the wars and ensured that certain German ideals flourished, even when German identities themselves were forced into a sort of cultural exile. Here we have, my family moving on. The top picture is my mom's baptism, 1958, being held by my great aunt Ursula in a Catholic church. That's showcasing that German religiosity. We come from southern Germany, a highly Catholic background. And then the bottom picture is, my grandmother, my mom, and my uncle sitting in the backyard of their split level suburban house in Buffalo Grove, Illinois, sometime in the late 60s. Um, now leading me to sort of an intersectionality. Already the German American experience is sort of an intersection of two different cultural experiences that align when it comes to whiteness. German American immigrants portrayed both an air of higher status than white Americans, but also adopted many American ideals of working class meritocracy, right, combined with loyalty both to Germany and to the American exceptionalism. And you can even see here is my family wearing full Bavarian garb in the middle of the Chicago suburbs, not too long after World War. Yet here they were able to really reap the benefits of this so-called American dream. German Americans surrendered certain German identity during the wars, but they maintained, racial supremacy ideologies that aligned with both of their cultural identities. And eventually, German Americans began to see themselves as purely American, especially since so many of their family, religious, and racial values began to align increasingly with American nationalism. It also bears mentioning that my family, when they lived in the States, despite them wearing full Bavarian regalia here, my grandfather was a strict disciplinarian and refused to let the German word be spoken in the house. So my grandmother, even though German was the only language she knew, she was forced to learn English. And they preferred being seen as Germans. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that my grandfather was working with and for people who had fought Germans in the war. So he really wanted to Americanize his family as much as possible. And this leads to sort of what we call a patriotic pluralism. The picture of my family shows that they did celebrate their German heritage, right? But they really promoted a deep pride in American identification, combined with sort of an implied pride and supremacy of the German heritage. A couple more pictures of my family from the 60s in the Chicago suburbs. No idea who the random dude holding my uncle is, but I'm sure he was a friendly neighbor. And get a kick out of those curtains. The Gosts, they moved to the burbs. The Gosts was my grandfather's family name. Um, it was my grandparents, Günther and Theresia Gost, with my mom, Ariane, and my uncle Tom. They moved from Germany through Switzerland and then to Chicagoland area in 63. And that was only 18 years after the war, right? Germans were our mortal enemy. Yet, 18 years later, my German white family were able to achieve the American dream in record time. Within a year of their arrival, they had 2 cars and a new split level home in Buffalo Grove, Illinois. Buffalo Grove, interestingly enough, had originally been settled by German farmers in the 19th century. And now, almost 100 years later, my German family was here to help build, a new quote unquote America, one free of strife and worry, one to raise children in safety, pool parties, Christmas plays, cookouts, Oktoberfest, and one that was absolutely free from any concept of race or racism. Weber highlights the German American unique ability to assimilate into American culture while in the post war era, being given the freedom to explore their own white ethnic roots by openly celebrating their German heritage when, during the same period, um, German Americans aligned their ideologies about race and white supremacy with those of the greater American society. Of course, redlining played a huge factor in why my white German family wasn't exposed to race or racism. White supremacy was built into my family's worldview so deeply that they were really only aware of their existence as new Americans and not necessarily of their white identity. What they experienced in Chicago was a fulfillment of, the myth of meritocracy, the American dream. They were systematically kept from the realities of race and racism by the racist policies of redlining that precluded people of color from living in Buffalo Grove. And even today, if you look at the racial demographics of today's Buffalo Grove, and there's a link in the references page to this page, the racial demographics still bear out the scars of redlining. The community today remains 95% white. There's a few Asians, and there's nothing else. No other ethnic identities are found in the Buffalo Grove area, and that is a direct testament to the policies of redlining. Here we go, my family again. Christmas tree, all that glitter, that lametta, and a lovely meal I had last winter, last time I was there in Germany. Resilience, resistance, and cultural preservation. So I already talked about this cultural preservation. And Weber points out by 1980 there were over 50 million Americans that self-identified as having a German heritage. That's a huge chunk of the American population, right? Casale establishes that German Americans were able to preserve, at least in small ways, their German heritage through the wars by showcasing their ability to move in and out of their American identities far, far more easily than people of African, Asian, or Eastern European descent. It also helps that such foods like bratwurst and pommes frites translates easy to the American hot dog. So much of German culture has influenced what we call American culture, throughout all levels. Marger, in the readings that we did in our class, claims that those who want to relinquish or hide their ethnicity in America rarely have the opportunity to do so, right? But in my case, the German American experience to accommodate Americanism, right, into our identities, as well as our ability to greatly influence American policies on race and white supremacy, really allowed people like my family to exist in this nation completely oblivious to what Alan Goodman would call the racial smog, right? I mean, they were living in the racial smog, but they weren't aware that there was a smog. They were able to align themselves with American nationalism because of their whiteness. Germans need never fear the erasure of their cultural heritage because it is so enmeshed with the ideals and the culture of the dominant American heritage. In conclusion, a few more images. There's my family at the top with my great aunt in Switzerland shortly before they moved to the States. And then you can see the middle picture. There's my grandmother at the wheel and my mom sitting up on the top of their brand new convertible in front of their split level yellow wood sided house. Maybe it's aluminum siding. Growing up in this segregated, what I call curated American suburbia, my family, along with many other German Americans, were able to flourish in America, right, due to their strong alignment with white identity. My grandmother would always refer to the great opportunity this land afforded people. But her experience was limited by the barriers that kept people unlike our white family out. Robin DiAngelo highlights, how these messages that my grandmother received about American exceptionalism and meritocracy were devoid of the realities of race and racism. So in 2020, when my grandmother became aware of the realities of American racism for the first time, when the story of George Floyd and police brutality sort of went across the globe, making people in Europe aware of what was happening over here after she received authentic information of the Black and immigrant experience in America, uncolored by her whiteness, she expressed discomfort, at the idea of minimizing her own experience and struggles as a white German immigrant. But now she is engaged increasingly in her own re-education and some paradigm shifting. And we hold regular conversations, talking about talking about the past and how things might not have always been how they seemed. Finally, I can definitely acknowledge that my family adapted and assimilated so easily into the dominant American culture because both their whiteness and their ignorance of racism highly favored their success in this white dominated society. And with that, I would like to thank you. You have one last picture. This was New Year's Eve. Uh, no idea when, probably in the early 1950s, judging by the dress. Um, this is my great grandfather, my grandmother, my great grandmother, and my great aunt. And at the very bottom is a little picture of the German Alps I took the last time I landed in Munich. It just happened to be sunrise, so it was super dramatic and really beautiful. And here is my references. Thank you so much.